3 weeks after the discovery of the lattice, Boreas Station had transformed from a research outpost into the most important place in human history, and every single person inside it could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on them, like the 14 kilometers of ice above the thing they had found. Marin had not told anyone about the ridge. She had checked the survey data 7 more times, and each time the answer was the same. The ridge had shifted, slowly and silently, in a direction that made no geological sense. But she kept this information locked inside her chest, like a grenade with the pin still in, because she needed more data before she could say what she was beginning to suspect. What she was beginning to suspect was impossible. Dr. Yosef Achebe had not slept in 4 days, and his eyes had taken on the glassy shine of a man who had seen something that had broken open his understanding of the universe, and was now trying to rebuild it with shaking hands. "It is learning," he told Marin in the quiet hours of the station's artificial night. Sitting in the xenolinguistics lab, surrounded by screens filled with waveform data that scrolled like the vital signs of something vast and patient. "Learning what?" Marin asked. "Us." Yosef had been sending structured electromagnetic pulses into the lattice. Simple mathematical sequences, prime numbers, geometric ratios. And the lattice had been responding, but not with echoes or simple acknowledgments the way a mirror bounces light back at the source. The lattice was correcting their math. When Yosef sent a sequence with an intentional error, the lattice sent the sequence back with the error fixed. And then it added something, an extension of the sequence that went further than human mathematics had ever gone, as if it were a teacher gently showing a student that the problem they were solving was just the first line of a much larger equation. "Is not just responding," Yosef said, and his voice cracked with the strain of speaking about something that his training had never prepared him for. "It is teaching us, the way you would teach a child who had just learned to count, with patience and care and a kind of tenderness that I cannot explain, but I can feel in the structure of the signals." Marin sat with that for a long time. The lattice, they had started calling it the pale web because of the way it glowed beneath the ice like a ghost made of geometry, was alive in every way that mattered, a nervous system that spanned the entire moon, conducting information and energy through pathways so complex that the station's most powerful computers could only map a fraction of them. But Yosef had come to a conclusion that made Marin's blood run cold. "The pale web is not the organism," he said, pulling up a diagram on his screen that showed the lattice network overlaid on a cross-section of Europa. "Think about it like this. When you look at a human brain, you do not say that the neurons are the person. You say the neurons are part of the person, a system that serves a larger whole." He pointed at the screen. "The pale web is a nervous system, Marin. It is the sensory and communication network of something much, much larger, something that the lattice is connected to, something that the lattice serves." "How large?" Marin whispered. Yosef did not answer because the answer was visible on the screen, and it was the kind of answer that made language feel small and useless. The pale web was connected to something beneath the subsurface ocean, something that the deep-range sensors could only see the edges of, something so vast that its outline matched the curvature of Europa itself. "The moon is not harboring life," Yosef said quietly. "The moon is a shell." Before Marin could respond, before she could process the enormity of what Yosef was saying, her comm unit screamed with an emergency alert, and Colonel Tanabe's voice filled the lab with the clipped efficiency of a man who had already made a decision and was not interested in debate. "All senior staff to command center immediately. We are proceeding with Operation Deepgate." Marin's stomach dropped because she knew exactly what Operation Deepgate was. Tanabe had been pushing for weeks to detonate deep penetration charges in the ice, to blast open a wider access shaft to the subsurface ocean, arguing that they needed direct access to whatever was down there before Earth's bureaucrats could tie their hands with committees and caution. She ran to the command center, and found Tanabe standing before a tactical display with his hands behind his back and his face set in the expression of a man who believed he was being brave when he was actually being afraid. "Colonel, you cannot do this," Marin said, and she did not care that every officer in the room turned to stare at her. "The lattice is reactive. It is a living system, possibly sentient, and if you detonate charges inside it, you could be causing harm to something we do not yet understand." Tanabe looked at her with the patience that powerful men reserved for people they had already decided to ignore. "Doctor, my orders from UTFA Command are clear. We need direct ocean access within 72 hours, and I intend to deliver. Your orders were written before we knew what the lattice was. My orders are my orders." Marin turned to the other scientists in the room and saw the same helpless fury in their eyes that she felt in her own chest. The rage of people who understood what was at stake, watching someone who did not make a decision that could not be unmade. The charges detonated at 0347 station time. The sound was not a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration that traveled through the ice and through the station, and through the bones of every human being. On Europa, like a scream translated into physics, and for 3 seconds, every instrument on Boreas station went dark. When the instruments came back online, the pale web was silent, not dimmed, not reduced, silent, dark, dead in a radius of 200 kilometers around the blast site, as if someone had torn a hole in a living tapestry, and the threads around the wound had simply stopped carrying light. Marin stood in the lab and watched the data, and felt tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe, because grief did not care about dignity. Then something worse happened. The silence deepened, not just the silence of the dead lattice, but a silence that seemed to press against the walls of the station, like a physical force, as if the very space around Europa had taken a breath and was holding it. And every person on the station felt it, the way animals feel an earthquake before it arrives, in their marrow, in the ancient part of their brains, that still remembered what it was to be prey. A young technician named Ria Vasquez was standing on the surface observation deck when the silence broke. She had been watching the southern horizon out of habit, checking the ridge that she had photographed a dozen times for her geological survey, and what she saw made her knees buckle, and her hand grabbed the railing so hard that her gloves tore. The ridge was gone. The long spine of ice that had stretched across the southern horizon since before Boreas Station existed. The feature that appeared on every map and every photograph. The ridge that Marin had watched shift in the night. It was simply not there anymore. In its place was a smooth expanse of white, featureless and vast. And in the center of that expanse were 2 enormous depressions in the ice, each one kilometers across, oval and deep and perfectly symmetrical. And Ria stared at them, and her mind refused to process what it was seeing until the depressions shifted, slightly, slowly, like the movement of something waking from a very long sleep. And she understood. They were eyes. They were closed eyes. And beneath them, the ice of Europa hummed with a vibration so deep that it was not a sound, but a feeling, a single pulse that said without words what Yosef would later translate from the pale web's final signal before it went dark. "Why did you wound me?" Ria ran inside and could not speak for 11 minutes, and when she finally found her voice, she said only 5 words that changed the course of human history. "It is alive, all of it." And 14 kilometers below, in the warm dark of an ocean older than human memory, something the size of a continent turned its attention fully toward the small bright creatures who had come to its surface and put fire in its flesh. And it waited with a patience that made glaciers look restless to see what they would do next. The white giant was no longer just watching. It was deciding. 72 hours after the detonation, Boreas Station existed in a state of controlled terror that everyone pretended was calm professionalism, because the alternative was screaming, and screaming would not help anyone when the thing beneath your feet was larger than your entire civilization's capacity to understand. Colonel Tanabe had not spoken about the blast since Ria's report, and the silence from him was louder than any order he had ever given, because it was the silence of a man who understood for the first time that he had made a mistake that could not be measured in human terms. The subsurface ocean was moving. Not the gentle tidal shifts caused by Jupiter's gravity that the scientists had modeled and predicted and published papers about. This was something else, something deliberate, a reorganization of trillions of tons of water that defied every gravitational model in the station's database, and suggested that the force causing it was not coming from the top, outside Europa, but from within. Something down there was repositioning itself the way a person shifts in bed when they are deciding whether to get up. Marin had taken command of the scientific response by default, because she was the only senior researcher who could still form complete sentences without her voice shaking, and she had organized the remaining staff into 3 teams. One to monitor the subsurface activity, one to attempt to restore contact with the pale web, and one to document everything, because if humanity did not survive this, then at least the record should. It was the documentation team that discovered the signal. At 0619 station time, every electronic device on Boreas station, every computer, every comm unit, every medical scanner, every coffee maker with a digital display received the same transmission simultaneously. And it was not coming through any antenna or receiver that the engineers could identify, because it was coming through the ice itself, conducted upward through the pale web, like a message sent through the nerves of a living world. Yosef decoded it in 11 minutes, and his hands were shaking so badly that Ria had to hold the display steady for him while he worked. The signal was a mathematical sequence, recursive, self-referencing, built on principles that human mathematics could describe, but had never combined in this way. And when Yosef translated its structure into linguistic meaning, the message was simple and devastating. Why did you wound me? Not an accusation, a question, genuine and patient, the way a parent might ask a child who had broken something precious, not with anger, but with a desire to understand. Marin read the translation and felt something crack inside her chest. That was not her heart, but was close to it. It was her certainty, the bedrock belief that humanity was the protagonist of its own story, the most important thing in whatever room it walked into. That belief crumbled like old ice under the weight of a single question from something that had been alive since before humanity's ancestors had crawled out of the ocean. "Can we respond?" she asked Yosef. "We have been responding since we arrived," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a revelation that had cost him 4 sleepless nights to reach. "Every electromagnetic signal we have ever produced on this moon, every radio transmission, every sensor pulse, every time someone used a microwave in the cafeteria, has been absorbed and analyzed by the pale web since the day we landed." He pulled up a timeline on his display. "It knows our language, Marin. All of them. Every language we have ever transmitted. And it has been learning our science and our mathematics, and our music and our arguments and our jokes for 2 years, sitting beneath us like a student in a library, reading everything we are." The implications of that settled over the room like snow. The white giant had been aware of them from the moment the first human boot touched Europa's ice, and it had said nothing, done nothing, simply watched and listened and learned with the patience of something for which 2 years was not even the blink of an eye. "Why did it not make contact?" Tanabe asked, and it was the first time Marin had heard uncertainty in his voice. "Because it was studying us," Yosef said, "the way we study microbes, with care, with curiosity, and with the understanding that the thing being studied does not need to know it is being studied." Tanabe's face went pale. The white giant made its next move at 1400 station time, and it was not an attack. Marin would spend the rest of her life being grateful for that. It was a demonstration. 30 kilometers south of Boreas Station, a section of Europa's ice crust rose into the black sky with a smoothness and silence that should have been impossible for something weighing billions of tons, lifting like a door in a floor, like a lid being removed from a box. And beneath it, the subsurface ocean was visible for the first time with human eyes, warm and glowing with bioluminescence that painted the underside of the surrounding ice in colors that had no names in any human language. And floating in that ocean, illuminated by their own light, were structures, not natural formations, not mineral deposits, not anything that geology or chemistry could explain. These were built things, or grown things, or perhaps both at once, because the distinction between built and grown might not exist for a being that was itself a world. And they rose from the ocean floor like a city dreamed by something that thought in dimensions humans could not perceive. Marin stood on the observation deck and looked at the opened ocean and the glowing structures beneath, and felt the same feeling she had felt holding the lattice sample in her hands for the first time, but magnified 1,000 times, the feeling of being small, of being witnessed, of standing before something so far beyond her comprehension that the only sane response was awe. The UTFA fleet arrived 6 hours later. 3 warships, heavy with weapons designed to crack asteroids and shatter moons, commanded by Admiral Constance Herrera, a woman with silver hair and calm eyes, who had fought in the Belt conflicts and had seen enough of the universe to know that the worst decisions were always made by people who were afraid. She listened to Marin's report in the station's command center without interrupting, and when Marin finished, Herrera sat in silence for a full minute before speaking. "You are telling me that this moon is a shell around a living entity that is older than our species, that it has been studying us for years, and that it just opened a door to show us what is inside?" "Yes, Admiral." "And what do you believe its intentions are?" Hesitated, because the honest answer was, "I do not know." And the honest answer after that was, "But it has not killed us yet, and it could have done so at any moment since we arrived, so perhaps its intentions are not hostile." Herrera nodded slowly. "You have 48 hours, Doctor. 48 hours to establish meaningful two-way communication and determine whether this entity is a threat. And if you cannot do that in 48 hours, then I will secure this moon by any means necessary, because I have 3 billion people on Earth who are counting on me to keep them safe." Marin wanted to argue, but she understood the Admiral's position, because fear was a reasonable response to the unknown, and Herrera was not being cruel, she was being human. The White Giant sent its second message at midnight, and this one was not directed at Boreas Station. Yosef detected it first, a massive pulse through the pale web, far more powerful than anything they had recorded. A signal that punched through Europa's ice shell and radiated outward into space, in every direction at once, like a shout into the dark. And when Yosef decoded it, the translation was incomplete, because the mathematical structures were more complex than anything the giant had sent before, layered with meanings that human language could only approximate. But the core of the message was clear enough to make every person in the room stop breathing. "They are here. They are young. I am deciding." Not a message to humanity, a message about humanity, sent to someone or something else, out there in the black between the stars. And the word deciding hung in the air like a blade. Marin looked at Yosef and asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. Deciding what? Yosef stared at his console, and the light from the pale web's data played across his face like the reflection of an ocean that existed far beneath their feet and far beyond there. Understanding. Whether we are worth keeping. The room was silent, and in that silence the ground hummed with the heartbeat of something ancient and vast, and 4,000 humans on a frozen moon, orbiting the largest planet in their solar system, waited to learn if the thing beneath them would choose mercy or judgment. And the white giant waited too, because patience was the one thing it had never run out of. And the small bright creatures on its surface were still speaking, and still reaching, and still refusing to be silent in the face of the infinite dark. And that, perhaps, was the answer it was looking for. His submersible was called the Krill, because the engineer who built it had a sense of humor about the size of things. And as it descended through the opening in Europa's ice shell into the warm, glowing ocean below, the 5 humans inside it understood the joke in a way that the engineer had never intended. They were small, impossibly, laughably, terrifyingly small, and the ocean they were entering belonged to something that could crush them without effort and without malice, the way a whale might crush a plankton and never know it had done so. Marin sat in the forward observation seat and watched the water change color around them as they descended. First, the pale blue of glacial melt, then a deeper azure, then a living turquoise that pulsed with bioluminescence so rich that the submersible's lights were unnecessary, and around them in every direction the ocean was filled with life. Not the microbial soup that the scientists had spent decades predicting, not the simple, single-celled organisms that the textbooks said were the most Europa could offer, but complex creatures, luminous and vast, drifting through the water like living constellations, organisms with bodies like cathedrals, and tendrils like rivers, and eyes, yes, eyes that tracked the Krill's descent with a calm intelligence that made Marin grip the armrest of her seat until her knuckles turned white. "They are beautiful," Rhea whispered from the seat behind her, and she was right. They were beautiful in the way that a thunderstorm is beautiful, in the way that the deep ocean is beautiful, in the way that anything is beautiful when it reminds you that the universe is not empty and never has been. Yosef monitored the pale web signals from his station at the back of the submersible, and reported that the lattice was guiding them, not with commands, but with gentle electromagnetic gradients that the Krill's navigation system interpreted as a path, a corridor through the ocean that led downward and inward towards something that the sensors could detect but not define. "It is inviting us," Yosef said, and there was wonder in his voice, and also the thin edge of fear that wonder always carries when the thing being wondered at is large enough to destroy you. They descended for 4 hours. The ocean of Europa was deeper than any ocean on Earth, a vast sphere of warm salt water wrapped around a rocky core that radiated heat from processes the scientists did not fully understand. And as the Krill went deeper, the life around them grew larger and stranger and more luminous, until Marin felt as though they were traveling through the bloodstream of a god. At a depth of 80 kilometers, they reached the structure. It rose from the ocean floor like a mountain made of light, a cathedral of living crystal that towered above them and extended below them and pulsed with the blue-white glow of the pale web, amplified 1,000-fold. Understood immediately what she was looking at, even though nothing in her training or her experience had prepared her for it. This was where the pale web converged. Every thread and filament and pathway of the lattice that spanned the moon came together here in a single point of overwhelming density and brightness. A nexus of information and energy that was to the white giant what a brainstem is to a human body. The place where thought became action, where sensation became understanding, where the raw data of existence was processed and remembered. "This is its mind," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper, because speaking loudly in this place felt like shouting in a temple. The Krill came to rest on a ledge of crystal that seemed to have formed specifically for them, a platform exactly the right size and shape for a human submersible, which meant that the giant had known they were coming and had prepared a place for them the way a host prepares a chair for a guest. Guest, not in words, not in electromagnetic signals, or mathematical sequences, or any of the methods they had been using to communicate through the pale web, but directly, in a way that bypassed their ears and their instruments, and went straight into their minds, like light through water. It showed them memories, The first memory was of darkness, pure, absolute, and ancient, the darkness that existed before Jupiter had fully formed, when the material that would become Europa was still a cloud of dust and ice orbiting a young star. And in that darkness, something stirred, something that had drifted through the void between stars for longer than the solar system had existed, a seed of consciousness so old that it had watched galaxies form and die like flowers in a garden. The white giant had not been born on Europa. It had come to Europa, drifting through space as a spore of living crystal, and when it found the young moon, it had burrowed inside and wrapped itself in ice and ocean and rock, and gone to sleep. And it had slept for billions of years, waking periodically to observe, to learn, to remember. It showed them the others, across the galaxy, in the ice shells of moons, and the frozen hearts of rogue planets, and the crystalline cores of comets that wandered the dark between stars. There were more of them, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each one a living world unto itself, a solitary titan drifting through the cosmos, and they were connected through methods that human physics could not yet describe, a network of ancient minds that stretched across the Milky Way like a web of whispered thoughts. They did not conquer, they did not build empires, or wage wars, or claim territory. They observed, and they remembered. And their memories stretched back to a time when the universe was young and hot, and the first stars were burning themselves into existence. They were the oldest living things in the cosmos, and they had been watching humanity since before humanity existed. The giant showed Marin this next part with particular care, as if it understood that what it was about to share would be the most important thing she had ever learned. It had been watching Earth for 300,000 years. It had watched the first humans walk upright on the African savanna and look up at the stars with eyes that held a hunger no other animal possessed, not the hunger for food or safety or reproduction, but the hunger to know, the desperate burning need to understand the world and their place in it, that drove them to paint on cave walls and count the stars and ask questions that the universe was under no obligation to answer. It had watched them discover fire and language and mathematics and agriculture and war, and it had watched them suffer ice ages and plagues and famines and genocides, and the thousand quiet cruelties that humans inflicted on each other in the name of fear and greed and misunderstanding. And through all of it, through every catastrophe and every dark age and every moment when the story of humanity should have ended, they refused to die. They broke and they healed, and they broke again and they healed again, over and over, century after century, with a stubbornness that the giant had never seen in any other species in its billions of years of observation. The giant gave this trait a name, and the name translated into human language as the bright wound. The paradox of a species that was constantly tearing itself apart and constantly putting itself back together, that carried its pain like a torch and used it to light the way forward. And then, with a tenderness that made Marin weep in a way she had not wept since she was a child, the giant told her why this mattered. Most species that reach the stars are elegant and efficient. They solve the equation of survival, and they become still, perfect, and complete, unchanging, and they drift through the cosmos like beautiful statues, alive, but no longer growing. You are not like them. You are messy and loud and contradictory, and you hurt each other, and you heal each other, and you never stop moving, never stop reaching, never stop asking why. And this is what makes you dangerous, and this is what makes you beautiful. I have watched 10,000 species reach for the stars, and you are the only ones who reached with bleeding hands. Marin floated in the crystal cathedral at the heart of a living world and felt the tears drift from her face in the low gravity, and she asked the only question that mattered. Will you let us stay? The giant paused, and the pause lasted 4 hours, during which the ocean shifted and the crystal walls hummed, and the 5 humans sat in their tiny submersible and waited, while something older than the sun considered their fate. Then it answered, "I will do more than let you stay. Will teach you what I know, the physics of stars and the architecture of space-time and the languages of worlds you have not yet imagined. But you must carry a burden in return. You must speak for the small things, the species that cannot cross the void, the lives that burn bright and brief on worlds that no one is watching, the ones who will never build ships or send signals or know that the universe is vast. You must be their voice because you are wounded enough to understand what it means to struggle and to survive." Marin surfaced 6 hours later, rising through the ice into the artificial light of Boreas Station, where Admiral Herrera stood waiting, with the full weight of humanity's military power behind her, and fear in her steady eyes. "Report, Doctor." Marin looked at her with tears still frozen on her cheeks, and a light in her eyes that had not been there when she descended. And she said the words that would change everything. "Stand down the fleet. We just became ambassadors to a god, and it chose us because we are broken." The Fang Eternal was not just a warship. It was a cathedral built to celebrate killing. Its corridors were lined with the bones and hides and preserved bodies of creatures from across the galaxy, mounted on walls and displayed behind glass like prizes at a fair. Except the fair was death, and the prizes had once been alive and afraid. The trophy hall sat in the center of the ship, a vast round chamber with a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow, and inside it stood rows of transparent cages arranged in a circle like an audience forced to watch its own captivity. Some of the cages held living creatures, a trembling six-legged herbivore from a jungle world, a winged thing the color of silver that pressed itself against the back of its cage and would not move, a massive Drelmathi herd beast with sad wet eyes that stood twice Mara's height and breathed in slow, heavy sighs. Some of the cages held things that were no longer alive, but had been preserved so perfectly they looked like they might blink at any moment. Mara was placed in a cage at the center of the circle, in the position of honor, which meant the position where every visitor to the hall could see her. She sat down on the cold floor, crossed her legs, put her hands on her knees, and looked around. She did not cry. This was not because Mara was not scared. She was deeply and terribly scared, in the way that only a child taken from everything she knows can be. But Mara had learned something from living with Sarge for 3 years, that fear was just a feeling, and feelings did not have to control what you did next. So instead of crying, she began to study her cage. The lock was electronic, a flat panel set into the doorframe, with a symbol that glowed blue when it was sealed, and she guessed it would glow green when it was open. The walls were transparent and hard, some kind of material she could not scratch with her fingernails. Guards passed the trophy hall, on a rotation, and Mara counted the time between each pass. She used her own heartbeat as a clock, the way her mother had taught her, when they played hiding games in the grain fields. 240 heartbeats between each guard. She stored this number in her mind, the way she stored everything, quietly and carefully. On the second day, a young Vithari came to her cage with a tray of food. This was Tala, a sub-hunter who had joined the crew of the Fang Eternal only recently, and who had not yet earned the scars and honors that the older hunters wore on their armor, like medals. Tala was smaller than the other Vithari, with scales that were a lighter shade of gray, and eyes that moved quickly and seemed to take in too much. Tala set the food tray in the slot at the base of the cage, and waited to see if the human child would eat. Mara looked at the food, some kind of protein block, and a container of water, looked up at Tala and said, "Thank you." Tala blinked all 4 eyelids at once, which was the Vithari expression for surprise. No specimen had ever thanked Tala before. "You speak Galactic Common," Tala said. "My school teaches it," Mara said. "We learn it so we can talk to other species when we grow up." "You will not grow up here," Tala said, and immediately regretted saying it, because the words were cruel, and Tala had not meant them to be cruel. Tala had meant them as a fact, but facts could be cruel too. Mara ate the protein block slowly, watching Tala's face. "What is this ship?" Mara asked. "The Fang Eternal, the greatest hunting vessel of the Vethari fleet," Tala said. "And all these creatures in these cages, you took them from their homes." "They were collected," Tala said, using the word the Vethari used instead of taken because it sounded better. "They are specimens." "They are scared," Mara said simply. Looked at the other cages, at the trembling herbivore and the frozen silver creature and the sad Drelmathi, and felt something shift uncomfortably in the space behind her ribs. "What is your name?" Mara asked. "Tala." "Tala, do you know what a honey badger is?" Tala did not. "You will," Mara said, and she smiled in a way that made Tala feel like the temperature in the room had changed. On the third day, Kravik Dal came to observe his newest trophy. The hunt captain stood before Mara's cage, with his upper arms folded across his chest, and his infrared pits scanning her small body, mapping her heat, her heartbeat, the flow of blood through her veins. "It has not broken," he said to his second-in-command, a scarred hunter named Vorath. "The xenobiology files say human juveniles are emotionally fragile. This one shows no signs of distress." "Perhaps it is defective," Vorath suggested. "Perhaps," Kravik said, but he made a note in his personal log. "The human juvenile displays atypical composure, and this interested him more than he wanted to admit." He leaned close to the cage and said, "Do you understand where you are, small thing?" Mara looked at him, looked up at 8 feet of armored venomous apex predator, and said, "You took me from my home, and you put me in a cage, and you think I am weak, because I am small and soft." Kravik tilted his great head. "I am not weak," Mara said. "I am just waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For my friend." Kravik made the Vethari sound that meant amusement, a low rumble from deep in his chest. "No one is coming for you, small thing. You are alone." Mara shook her head slowly and said, "He is coming. He always comes, and he doesn't stop." Kravik walked away and dismissed the child's words as the desperate hope of a captured creature, because that was what prey did. They hoped, and then they broke. But he would not understand how wrong for several more days. Far behind the Fang Eternal, across a stretch of cold black space, the Terran Defense Force patrol ship Reclamation was burning hard on an intercept course. Commander Josepha Mwangi stood on the bridge and studied the tactical display, and made calculations that did not add up in her favor. The Fang Eternal was a warship with 200 hunters aboard, and weapons that could crack a small moon. The Reclamation was a patrol ship with a crew of 40, and weapons designed for pirates and smugglers, not apex predator dreadnoughts. A straight fight would last about 4 minutes, and none of those minutes would be good. But Mwangi had not survived 20 years in the Terran Defense Force by fighting fair. She called her Marine squad leader to the bridge and laid out a plan, a boarding action, fast and surgical, timed to hit the Fang Eternal during a scheduled engine cooldown cycle. Sensors would be running at reduced power. "Small team," she said. "Get in, get the girl, get out, before they know what happened." The squad leader, a woman named Reyes, with a jaw like a shovel and eyes that had seen too much, looked at the plan and nodded slowly, and then said, "And the animal." Because Sarge was on the ship. Sarge had been brought aboard at New Verdana, and the medical team had treated his injuries as best they could, and then tried to put him in a recovery cage, and Sarge had destroyed the recovery cage, and then destroyed a second recovery cage, and then sat in the corridor outside the armory and refused to move. The ship's xenobiologist had scanned him and reported that the honey badger had 3 cracked ribs, a fractured skull plate, cuts across 40% of his body, and residual alien venom still circulating in his blood. His adrenal output was 4 times the normal level for his species. His pain indicators were at maximum. He was fully alert and attempting to chew through the armory door in the general direction the Vethari ship had gone. The xenobiologist had asked Commander Mwangi if they should sedate him. Mwangi had looked at the honey badger, 14 kilograms of fury and damage and absolute unbreakable purpose, and she had said 2 words that would later become famous in Terran Defense Force history. Bring him. Reyes added Sarge to the boarding team roster. The Marines were not happy about this. Sarge did not care about their happiness. Sarge cared about exactly one thing in the universe, and that thing was in a cage on an alien warship, and every molecule of his small and terrible body was aimed at getting her back. The Reclamation flew on through the dark, and the distance between the 2 ships grew smaller with every hour. And in her cage aboard the Fang Eternal, Mara ate her food and counted guard rotations and quietly asked Tala questions about how the ship worked, and stored every answer in her memory like ammunition. Because Mara was 7 years old, and she could not fight a ship full of hunters, but she could learn, and she could wait. And she knew with the certainty that only comes from loving something that has never once let you down, that somewhere behind her in the dark, something small and angry and covered in blood was coming to get her, and it would not stop until it did. 3 days into the Fang Eternal's journey home, Mara had become the most well-behaved specimen in the history of the Vethari Trophy Hall. She ate her food without complaint. She slept at regular hours. She spoke politely to Tala when Tala came to check on her, and she sat quietly in her cage with the patience of a creature 10 times her age. The Vethari guards barely looked at her anymore. This was exactly what Mara wanted, because while the guards stopped watching, Mara had not stopped learning. She had memorized the full guard rotation, 240 heartbeats between each pass, a longer gap of 400 heartbeats during the shift change and what the Vethari called the deep dark hour. She had listened to the guards speak to each other and picked up 6 words of the Vethari language, including the words for open and door and down and quiet, and the word that seemed to mean harmless, which was the word they used when they talked. About her, she had asked Tala to explain how the cage lock worked. For my school project about alien technology, she had said, and she had said it with such wide-eyed, innocent curiosity that Tala had explained the entire mechanism without once considering that a 7-year-old might be memorizing the information for a different purpose. The lock was a magnetic seal controlled by a palm print reader keyed to Vethari biology. Mara could not open it with her own hands, but she now knew that it could be opened, and knowing a thing was possible was the first step toward making it happen. On the evening of the 3rd day, Kravik Dal held a ceremonial dinner in the great hall of the ship, and he brought Mara's cage to the center of the room so that his 40 senior huntsmen could see his newest acquisition. Kravik stood before his officers in full ceremonial armor, his scales polished, his venomous spurs gleaming, and he spoke about the great hunt and the glory of the Vethari and the weakness of the species they had conquered. He pointed at Mara's cage and said, "Observe the human, a species with no claws, no armor, no venom, no speed. They are soft in body and fragile in spirit, the gentlest prey the galaxy has offered us." 40 Vethari hunters made sounds of approval. Mara stood in her cage and looked at them. 40 armored predators, each one capable of killing her with a single blow, and she felt the fear rise up inside her like cold water filling a cup. But she did not let the cup overflow. She opened her mouth and spoke in broken Vethari, 6 words strung together with terrible grammar but perfect clarity. "My friend comes, he not stop." The hall went quiet for one breath, and then erupted in the deep rumbling sound of Vethari laughter. Kravik smiled with all of his teeth, which in a Vethari was not a friendly expression, but a display of dominance, and said, "What friend could a soft little thing like you possibly have that would concern a hunter?" Mara said nothing more, because she had said what she needed to say, and she had learned from Sarge that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stop talking and let the silence do the work. In the back of the hall, Tala did not laugh. After the dinner, Tala went to the ship's database and opened the xenobiology files on Earth and searched for the word that Mara had used days earlier, honey badger. Tala found the entry for Mellivora capensis. Tala read about an animal that weighed less than most Vethari hunting equipment, an animal that regularly attacked creatures many times its size, including large cats and venomous snakes, an animal whose skin was so thick and loose that it could be grabbed by a predator and twist inside its own hide to bite the attacker, an animal whose resistance to venom was so extreme that it could be bitten by a cobra and simply sleep it off, and then eat the cobra. At the bottom of the file there was a note added by a Terran military attaché. The note said, "Do not engage, not worth it, nothing is worth it." Tala closed the file and sat very still for a long time. Far behind the Fang Eternal, the Reclamation had found its moment. Commander Mwangi's crew had intercepted a Vethari communication buoy and decoded the Fang Eternal's engine maintenance schedule, and they knew that in exactly 6 hours, the great warship would drop to minimum power for a cooldown cycle. Sensors reduced, point defense systems offline, the entire ship running quiet and slow. Mwangi briefed the boarding team in the Reclamation's cargo bay. 4 Marines in light assault armor, 1 combat medic, and Sarge. The Marines stood in a line and checked their weapons and tried to look like professionals who were not at all concerned about the fact that they were about to board a warship full of the galaxy's most dangerous predators with a team of 5 humans and 1 very small, very angry animal. Sarge sat in the insertion pod and did not look concerned, because Sarge had never once in his life looked concerned about anything. Marine Sergeant Reyes looked at the honey badger and then at Mwangi and said, "Commander, with respect, the animal is not trained for shipboard combat operations." Sarge turned his head and looked at Reyes, and his translator collar said one word, "Move." The insertion pod launched during the cooldown cycle. A tiny metal shell fired from the Reclamation's underside on a ballistic arc. No engines, no heat signature, just a cold, dark shape falling toward the belly of the Fang Eternal like a stone dropped into a pond. It hit the ventral maintenance hull with a soft magnetic clamp, and the Marines cut through the outer plating in 90 seconds, and they were inside. The ship was enormous and dark and smelled like a place where things died. The Marines moved through maintenance tunnels and access corridors, following the route that Mwangi's intelligence team had mapped from the intercepted communications. Sarge followed for approximately 45 seconds. Then Sarge went his own way. He turned left where the team turned right, and vanished into a ventilation duct that was barely wide enough for his body, and the Marines called after him in harsh whispers. And Sarge did not respond, because Sarge had never in his life responded to anyone telling him where to go. He moved through the ducts by smell, Mara's smell, a scent he knew better than his own, the smell of dirt and soap, and the particular warmth of a human child he had slept next to every night for 3 years. The ducts were not designed for creatures like Sarge, but that did not matter, because Sarge was not designed for anything. He was simply built by millions of years of evolution on a planet that did not care about design and only cared about survival. He squeezed through gaps that should have stopped him, and climbed vertical shafts that should have defeated him. And he moved through the guts of the Fang Eternal like a disease the ship did not know it had caught. In a service corridor on the ship's lower deck, Sarge found his first Vethari. The hunter was alone, performing a routine maintenance check on a power conduit. He was 8 feet tall and armored, and armed with a sidearm that could burn a hole through a wall. He weighed roughly 40 times what Sarge weighed. Dropped from the ceiling vent onto the hunter's head. What happened next was not graceful or tactical or anything that a military academy would teach. It was fast and brutal and confusing, and it sounded like a bag of tools being thrown into a blender. And when it was over, the Vethari was on the ground, making sounds he had never made before. And Sarge was standing on the hunter's chest, with blood on his mouth, most of it not his own. The hunter had managed to hit Sarge with a venomous spur during the fight, a strike that delivered enough toxin to paralyze a creature 4 times Sarge's size. Sarge's body processed the venom the way it processed every other thing the universe threw at it, with contempt. His left shoulder burned and his muscles twitched, and for about 10 seconds his vision went blurry. And then his immune system did whatever impossible thing honey badger immune systems do, and the venom became nothing more than a bad feeling that made him angrier. Sarge kept moving. He left the hunter behind, and climbed back into the ducts, and followed the smell of his girl through the dark corridors of a ship that had been built by the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. And the ship did not know it yet. But the most dangerous thing aboard was 14 kilograms and covered in fur, and had already decided that every single creature between him and Mara was simply a problem that had not yet been solved. And Sarge was very, very good at solving problems.